20 miles a day, every single day. Sandals slicing into raw flesh, backs bent under 60 pounds of gear, the air thick with dust and sweat. Punishment so merciless that a single mistake could mean death. This wasn't glory. This wasn't honor. This was the daily torment of a Roman legionary, the men who carried the empire on their bleeding shoulders. Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome to another journey into the darker corners of history. Tonight's journey will be long and winding, like the Roman roads themselves. There's no need to follow every word. Let the story wash over you like distant thunder, carrying you back through time at whatever pace feels right. Some listeners will hear Marcus's complete tale. Others will drift away somewhere in the German forests or during a quiet moment by a campfire. Both journeys are perfect. So settle deeper now, and let us begin where all soldier stories begin, with a boy who dreamed of something greater than the life he knew. Tonight, we walk not with emperors or senators, but with the soldiers, the ordinary men whose lives were filled with exhaustion, fear, and endless discipline. As you settle in, let the noise of the present world fade away. Imagine instead the crack of the centurion's staff, the clatter of iron against iron, the sting of dust and heat on your skin. Let your mind drift back 2,000 years to the harsh, unrelenting world of Rome's legions. The day begins before the sun. A sharp blast from the centurion's whistle cuts through the icy dawn, tearing 6,000 men from shallow sleep. No feather beds, no warmth, only stiff bodies rising from hard earth, already aching from yesterday's march, forced to repeat it all again. The first burden is the pack. More than 60 pounds strapped to the body with cruel precision, a shield nearly as tall as its owner, an iron helmet, javelins, a short sword, rations of stale bread and sour wine, tools for digging and building, even stakes for a wall that will vanish tomorrow. A Roman soldier was never just a fighter. He was a mule, a laborer, a machine carrying empire on his back. Add signa to the standards. Shields clatter, sandals slap. A column forms like a bronze serpent winding through the countryside. Ahead lies 20 miles at Rome's pace, relentless, punishing, designed to break the body before it breaks the enemy. Iron hobnails spark against stone, the sound echoing like the heartbeat of conquest. The sun climbs higher, helmets becoming furnaces on raw scalps. Dust clouds choke every breath. Straps bite deep, carving grooves into shoulders already scarred. And always the vine staff waits, ready in the centurion's fist, cracking across backs of those who falter. Marcus Aurelius Brutus stumbles beneath his shield, 19 years old, his farmer's hands blistered from weeks of carrying steel instead of soil. His sandals are split, soaked with blood, but still he marches. Ahead of him stretches the bronze tide of the 10th Legion. Behind him trudges Gaius Maximus, scarred veteran of 15 years, who mutters advice that keeps Marcus alive. Don't think, just follow the helmet in front of you. The moment you think, you'll break. Hours pass. Men collapse in the dust. Some are hauled onto wagons, their careers over before they began. The rhythm of marching becomes hypnotic after the first few miles. Left foot, right foot, the crunch of hobnailed sandals on packed earth. Marcus finds his mind drifting as his body moves automatically. The weight that seemed impossible an hour ago now feels like part of him. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but familiar. Like carrying a stone that grows heavier with each step, yet somehow his shoulders adapt, his legs find their pace. Around him, 6,000 men move as one organism. No individual voices, just the steady percussion of an army on the march. It's almost peaceful in its way. this surrender of personal will to the greater rhythm. Marcus understands now why veterans speak of the march with something approaching fondness, not love, but recognition. This is what they are. This is what they do. Step by step, mile by mile, carrying Rome on their backs toward whatever waits beyond the horizon. Others are left behind, silent sacrifices to Rome's endless appetite. Discipline is absolute. Mercy has no place on the road. At last, the order, rest! 10 minutes. 6,000 men collapse where they stand. Marcus drains 3 sips of warm water, each drop a treasure. Beside him, Gaius chuckles bitterly. It gets easier after the first 10 years. But rest is short. Too soon, the whistle shrieks again. Packs are heaved onto bleeding shoulders, sandals strike the dirt, and the march continues into the burning afternoon. When night finally falls, relief proves cruel. The day's ordeal ends not in rest, but in labor. Picks and shovels flash in torchlight as the army digs trenches, raises palisades, builds a fortress from nothing. Every ditch measured, every wall inspected. Failure means death if the enemy comes in the night. Marcus swings his pick with hands already torn raw, muscles screaming. The sound of iron on stone thunders through the camp until near midnight, when at last the fortress stands ready. Only then do the men collapse into leather tents, pressed shoulder to shoulder, bodies broken, spirits beaten down. Tomorrow, the whistle will shriek again. Another 20 miles. Another day of silence, blood, and the unending grind of empire. And Marcus knows, with the clarity of exhaustion, the truth of his life. He no longer belongs to himself. His body, his strength, his will, all consumed by Rome. They came for the young men like hunters stalking prey. Roman recruiters swept through the countryside in the dead of night, their torches throwing jagged shadows across trembling walls. Villagers knew the sound before they saw the riders, the heavy thud of hooves, the jangle of armor. And they knew what it meant. Suns would vanish before dawn. Unlike the polished speeches of modern armies, Roman recruitment was closer to abduction. Volunteers existed, but far more often men were seized, marked, and consumed by the empire's endless appetite. In the provinces especially, where resentment smoldered, the recruiters came with swords drawn, ready to crush resistance. Marcus Aurelius Brutus was 19 when they came for him. He was in his father's fields, gathering grain for the winter, when the horizon darkened with dust. At first, he hoped for traitors, but then came the glint of bronze helmets, shields catching the blood-red light of sunset. His stomach dropped. Rome had arrived. At their head rode Centurion Quintus Fabius, scarred and merciless, with the cold eyes of a man who had lived too long with death. He scanned the farm like a butcher surveying animals before slaughter. Behind him rode a dozen soldiers, grim and armored, weapons bared to remind everyone of Rome's power. Lucius, Marcus's father, stepped forward clutching a worn tool. His voice trembled as he greeted the officer. "Good evening, Centurion. How may we serve Rome?" Fabius dismounted, boots crunching on the dry soil. "I need men for the legions, strong backs, stronger wills. How many sons?" The question struck like a blade. Marcus's mother clutched his shoulder. His younger brother gasped. The unspoken truth became terrifyingly real. Rome had come to take. "2," Lucius answered, voice low. "Marcus is 19. Young Gaius is only 14. Fabius strode toward Marcus, inspecting him like cattle at market. He checked his teeth, gripped his arms, pressed at his shoulders. Cold eyes stared into his, searching for fear or defiance. Good build, strong hands. He'll do. Marcus's mother fell to her knees. "Please, Centurion, he is our eldest. Without him, the harvest will fail. We'll starve." Fabius didn't flinch. Rome needs soldiers more than farmers. He will serve the empire, and if the gods favor him, return with land of his own. His words were flat, practiced. He had heard the same pleas thousands of times, and they meant nothing. Marcus felt the weight of choice crush him. Resistance would bring pain to his family. His brother was too young to protect them, and a part of him, though he hardly admitted it, longed to prove himself beyond these fields. "I'll serve," he said. The words shocked even him. "I'll go willingly." Fabius studied him, then gave a cold smile. "Rare. Most boys fight like cornered dogs." He signaled to a scribe. "Mark him as a volunteer. It looks better in the records." The lie stung. Marcus knew his choice had been no choice at all. But it was done. He was given 1 hour to say farewell. That hour became a lifetime's worth of grief. His mother pressed a bronze amulet into his hand, whispering blessings through tears. His father gave him their last coins, a useless gesture against the empire's machinery, but a father's desperate act of love. His younger brother promised to care for the farm, though everyone knew he could not. When Marcus looked back at his home for the final time, the stone walls, the olive trees, the soil he had worked since boyhood, it already seemed like memory, fading as quickly as the dust under the soldiers' boots. Years later, Marcus would remember that last glimpse of home not with bitterness, but with a strange clarity. The way morning light caught the olive leaves, his mother's voice calling chickens to feed, the smell of bread baking in the stone oven. These memories would become treasures, polished smooth by repetition in the long watches of the night. At 19, he thought he was leaving childhood behind to become a man. He didn't yet understand that he was leaving one kind of life to enter another entirely, a world where such gentle memories would seem like stories from a dream. But for now, walking through dust toward his uncertain future, he carried those images with him like coins in a purse, not yet knowing how precious they would become. The recruiters gathered others from nearby villages. Titus Cornelius, a blacksmith's son whose father had offered bribes in vain. Gaius Valerius, a limping 17-year-old who should have been disqualified, but desperation lowered standards. Some walked with grim resolve. Others sobbed, cursing Rome between gasps. A few tried to escape and were beaten bloody. For 3 days, they marched toward the military base. No sleep beyond brief collapses. Hard bread that broke teeth, sour wine that burned the throat, cheese crawling with mold. The young men gagged, but the centurions told them this was luxury compared to what lay ahead. Beatings fell on anyone who slowed. By the second night, Marcus's feet were blistered raw, and yet the march never stopped. At dawn on the 4th day, they arrived. Stone barracks stretched before them, training yards ringing with steel, the air thick with smoke, sweat, and command. Here, their old lives would be erased. The transformation began with the oath, the sacramentum. An officer stood before them, voice booming. "Do you swear by Jupiter and by the genius of the emperor to obey your officers, to serve faithfully, and to die before deserting the standards?" "I swear," Marcus whispered with the others. The words fell like chains across his soul. Then came the branding. A hot iron seared flesh, marking them as property of the Roman state. Marcus bit leather, forcing silence as pain roared through him. The stench of burnt skin filled his lungs. Those who cried out were mocked and singled out for punishment. Finally, the assignments. Marcus was handed papers naming him to the 10th Legion, Caesar's old legion, famed for glory and for blood. An honor, Fabius told him. Marcus felt only dread. The barracks swallowed him next. 60 men, crammed together on straw pallets, sharing stench, fear, and despair. His bunkmate, Lucius Flavius from Gaul, laughed bitterly. Soldier or slave, What's the difference? At least soldiers get fed. As Marcus lay in the dark that night, listening to sobs, prayers, and hollow snores, he realized the boy from the farm was gone. Tomorrow training would begin. A new life of iron discipline, endless drills, and killing on command. For now, in the last hours before dawn, he clutched his mother's amulet and tried to remember the smell of home. By morning, even that would begin to fade. The first time Marcus shouldered his legionary kit, it felt like Rome itself had climbed onto his back. The weight, 60 pounds of iron, leather, wood, and misery, pressed down on his shoulders with a cruelty that was both physical and spiritual. This wasn't equipment. This was empire, strapped to the bleeding flesh of men reduced to beasts of burden. "Pick it up, boy," barked Sergeant Quintus Maximus, the grizzled quartermaster whose face was a map of scars. His voice was half gravel, half sneer, the sound of a man who had carried this load for 30 years and still hated it. Marcus bent and lifted the scutum, the great curved shield of Rome. Nearly as tall as he was, layered wood reinforced with iron, 22 pounds of defensive salvation. The moment he took it into his grip, the leather strap bit cruelly into soft palms uncalloused by war. "This," Maximus said, tapping the shield with a knuckle, "is your wall, your roof, your table, and your coffin lid if the gods are unkind. Learn to love it. You'll die under it, one way or another." Next came the gladius, a short, unpretentious blade strapped to Marcus's hip. Maximus drew his own in demonstration, a simple thrust that pierced the air. Don't slash. Slashing's for barbarians. Thrust. The point kills. Keep it sharp enough to shave with. Your life depends on it. Then the pila, two long, awkward javelins that Marcus nearly dropped when their weight shifted. Maximus showed the recruits the flexible iron shank. These aren't spears. They're curses. You throw one, it ruins a man's shield forever. He drops it or dies under it. Either way, you win. Marcus tried to balance one, but his arms already ached. He could feel blisters forming before the march had even begun. The helmet came next, a bronze dome with cheek guards that cut his vision. The world suddenly shrank, his hearing muffled, his neck straining to bear the new load. "Keeps your brains where they belong," Maximus said dryly. "Don't complain about sweat. Sweat means you're alive." Then the Larica Hamata, chainmail, 30 pounds of linked iron rings that dragged him down like drowning water. As Maximus pulled it over his head, Marcus's chest tightened. The armor clung to him, heavy and unyielding, every breath a negotiation. "This," Maximus grunted, "is the line between you and the grave. It'll rub you raw, cook you alive in summer, freeze you in winter, but it'll turn a blade better than bare skin. Count that as a blessing." Marcus staggered as each item joined the load, the dagger at his belt, the iron-studded caligae biting into his feet, the wool cloak itching at his neck, the leather satchel tugging at his side. Then, the worst indignity, the tools, a spade, a pick, a saw. "You're not just killers," Maximus said, handing them out like curses. "You're diggers, builders, slaves with iron spines. Every camp you sleep in, you build. Every road you march, you pave. Rome's empire is carved with your sweat." By the time the tent section and cooking pot were added, Marcus could hardly stand. The final insult was food. 3 days' worth of biscuit, pork, cheese, and a water skin that sloshed like a stone weight at his hip. Every ounce felt unnecessary, yet every ounce was survival. At last, Sergeant Maximus stepped back, arms crossed, watching the recruits sway like reeds in the wind. "Feels impossible, doesn't it?" he said with a wolf's grin. "Every boy thinks the same on his first day. But you'll learn. You'll adapt. Not because you're strong, but because Rome will break you if you don't. And then the march began. 10 miles under the sun, the recruits staggered, shields banging, sandals clattering on the packed earth. Shoulders bled where straps rubbed raw, feet blistered until each step was fire. Marcus's chest heaved against the chainmail, every breath dragging the smell of sweat and hot iron into his lungs. Men vomited, collapsed, begged. The centurion's answer was always the same: the lash. "Enjoy this," Centurion Brutus roared as they stumbled past him. "This is paradise. Flat ground, good weather, no one shooting arrows at you. Wait until Germania. There, you'll carry this load through forests so thick you choke on pine needles, with wolves howling at night and barbarians waiting in every shadow. That's when you'll wish for training marches like these." Marcus pushed forward, teeth clenched. Each step was survival. Each mile was punishment. And yet, slowly, something shifted. His body did not break. The straps carved grooves into his shoulders, but they held. His back screamed, but it bore the weight. His legs trembled, but they did not collapse. By the time they stumbled back into camp, Marcus understood the truth. The equipment was no longer separate from him. It was an extension of his body, an iron parasite feeding on his strength. He could not live without it. He could not move without it. It owned him. At night, lying in the barracks with his shield against his body and his sword within reach, Marcus felt something terrifying. Without the 60 pounds crushing him, he felt naked, vulnerable, incomplete. That was Rome's genius. The empire did not just burden its soldiers with tools and weapons, it fused them to their misery until they could not imagine life without it. The weight never grew lighter. It never would. But Marcus's mind began to accept what his body had no choice but to endure. 25 years of carrying Rome on his bleeding shoulders, one agonizing step at a time. The vine staff was more than wood. It was Rome itself, carried in a centurion's hand, a symbol of law carved from the blood of men who had broken under its weight. When it cracked against flesh, the sound was not just punishment. It was the empire reminding its soldiers that obedience was survival and disobedience was death. Marcus first saw its power in his second week of training. A recruit named Gaius Petronius, worn down by endless drills, made the mistake of sitting during formation. It was nothing, a moment's weakness. But in the legions, there were no small mistakes. Centurion Lucius Brutus saw him. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. The air itself seemed to tighten. "Stand up, Petronius," Brutus said, calm, almost gentle. That quiet voice was more terrifying than a scream. Petronius scrambled to his feet, stammering apologies. Silence. The word fell like a blade. Brutus walked slowly toward him, his vine staff tapping his leg with each step, each tap like the ticking of a funeral drum. The vites, 2 feet of seasoned grapevine, flexible enough to bend, hard enough to break bone, was the centurion's badge of office. But to the men, it was a predator. "Do you know why it's called a vine staff, Petronius?" Brutus asked softly, circling the boy. "Because vines choke the life from whatever they cling to. Discipline does the same. It strangles the civilian out of a soldier, one blow at a time. Bend over, grab your ankles." Petronius hesitated. That hesitation condemned him. The first strike sounded like a branch snapping. Petronius gasped, blood already soaking through his tunic. "Count them and thank me." 1. "Thank you, centurion." The second blow landed on the same spot, calculated for agony. Petronius screamed this time. Men in the ranks flinched, but dared not move. Marcus's stomach churned, knowing it could just as easily be him. 2. "Thank you, centurion." On and on it went. The staff fell with mechanical precision. By the 5th strike, Petronius sobbed openly. By the 10th, his voice broke to a whisper. At 15, he could barely stand, yet he obeyed, tears streaking his face. "Face the formation," Brutus ordered. The recruit turned, broken but standing. Brutus displayed him like a warning sign. This is what happens when you forget you are Rome's property. Your comfort, your weakness, your civilian softness, all of it dies here. Obedience is life. Disobedience is death. His gaze swept the line and settled briefly on Marcus. Some of you think this is cruel. A man who sits today will run tomorrow. Better to break him now than bury him later. The logic was brutal, but no one could deny it. That night, Marcus heard the whispers of older soldiers around the campfires. Punishments far worse than Petronius's beating. Men caught sleeping on guard duty, stoned to death by their own comrades. Deserters crucified at the edge of camp, left to rot as crows pecked their flesh. Whole units decimated, 1 in 10 chosen by lot, beaten to death by their brothers. The stories weren't history lessons. They were warnings. Rome's discipline was not abstract. It was blood in the dirt, terror carved into men's minds, and Brutus's staff was everywhere. A tap on the shoulder for posture, a sting across the shin for spacing, a crack against a shield when attention wandered. It was never idle. The recruits began to feel it, even when it wasn't there, flinching at shadows, moving with machine precision, their humanity slowly ground down. Marcus tended Petronius's wounds that night. Cold water, strips of cloth, no medicine, no rest, no sympathy. Petronius thanked him with a broken voice. But Marcus knew the real lesson wasn't for Petronius. It was for the 100 men who had watched. In the lamplight of the tent, surrounded by sleeping men, there was almost a tenderness to these moments. Soldiers caring for soldiers, knowing that tomorrow any of them might need the same mercy. Marcus worked quietly, his hands learning a soldier's gentleness, efficient, careful, asking no questions. These were the bonds that would sustain them through what was coming. Not the glory the recruiters had promised, but something simpler and more valuable. The knowledge that someone would remember your name, would tend your wounds, would carry your story if you didn't make it home. Petronius's eyes held gratitude that went deeper than words. In the morning, the discipline would return. The Vine staff would find new targets. But in these quiet hours between duty and dawn, they remained briefly human. Over weeks, Marcus realized the Vine staff wasn't just punishment, it was transformation. It reshaped men into tools, choking out hesitation, mercy, individuality. He began to sense it working on him too. His movements sharper, his words fewer, his mind calculating risk with every breath. He feared it, hated it, and yet part of him already understood. In time, he would be grateful for it. Because without that staff, without Rome's discipline, he would not survive. The Vine staff was Rome's hand, yes, but Marcus was learning that even Rome's grip was not absolute. In the spaces between commands, in the quiet care soldiers showed each other, in the small acts of kindness that discipline could not quite erase, something else survived. It would take time to understand this fully. For now, Marcus simply accepted what he could not change and tried to protect what he could. The Vine staff had marked him, but it had not broken him. Not yet. Perhaps with wisdom and luck, not ever. The seasons turned, as they always do, and with them Marcus learned new lessons about what it meant to carry Rome's weight. The first thing Marcus noticed wasn't the tents, or the walls, or the order. It was the smell. The camp stank like nothing he had ever known, a choking mixture of sweat, leather, smoke, waste, and something sweetly rotten that seemed to seep out of the earth itself. It clung to him, soaked into his clothes, his hair, his skin. Visitors gagged and covered their faces, but the soldiers lived in it, breathing it until it became part of them. The 10th Legion's camp stretched across land that had once been fertile farms. Now it was a city of war. Wooden barracks for officers, endless rows of leather tents for the rank and file. Marcus's tent was a papilio, stitched from hides that each man carried on his back. He shared it with 7 others, 8 men crammed into a space smaller than a peasant's hut. They slept shoulder to shoulder like pigs in a pen, every cough, every fart, every nightmare echoing in the dark. Privacy ceased to exist. They were a strange family. Gaius Valerius, the limping boy who had survived training, lay curled at the edge each night, his breath wheezing softly. Titus Cornelius, the blacksmith's son, was built like an ox, his laughter shaking the canvas. Marcus Flavius, the Gaul, cursed in his native tongue whenever he burned himself on hot stew. Lucius Maximus, freedman's son from Rome, never let them forget he thought himself better, though his soft hands blistered first. Quintus Brutus, another farm boy, reminded Marcus of his younger brother, open-hearted, too trusting, and an easy mark for pranks. Gaius Antonius, a veteran with 2 years' service, drank whenever he could and muttered about promotions stolen from him. Then there was Decimus Cassius, the quiet one, from the city slums. He stared at the ground, like he was already measuring how far it would be to run. Marcus learned their snores, their tempers, their habits. He learned to roll with their elbows in the night, to ignore the stink of their feet, to eat with their sweat dripping nearby. In time, he knew them better than his own family. Whether he liked it or not, these 7 strangers were his world. The days began before dawn. Trumpets screamed them awake, not music but war itself tearing into their ears. Within moments, they had to be standing, armored, weapons ready. The morning inspection was worse than battle. Centurions stalked through the ranks with vine staffs, eyes sharp as blades. A speck of rust, a crooked strap, even a dirty face could mean a strike that left blood on the ground. Marcus scrubbed his armor until his fingers bled, lined up his kit with the precision of a priest arranging offerings, and still flinched as Brutus's gaze swept over him. Breakfast, when it came, was punishment disguised as food. Hard biscuits that had to be soaked in wine or water until they softened into a foul paste. Cheese more green than white. Pork so salted it could crack. Teeth. Sometimes, when fortune smiled, a stew, a brief mercy in weeks of misery. The bread was often moldy, but mold was better than hunger. Water was worse. Wells inside the camp often ran foul, tainted by waste and filth. Soldiers drank because they had no choice, then cursed as their bellies cramped and their bodies emptied into the latrines. And those latrines? Gods. The latrines. Long trenches buzzing with flies, lined with planks, slick with filth, filled with a stench that seemed to crawl into the lungs. Marcus timed his visits carefully, waiting for quiet hours, but even then the air made his eyes water. He learned to breathe shallow, to do what had to be done quickly, and get out before the gagging overcame him. Disease was everywhere. Coughs rattled through the tents at night. Men doubled over with dysentery. The unlucky wasted away, their bodies carried out to shallow graves. The camp physicians were worse than useless, bleeding sick men until they grew weaker. Rumors spread of soldiers healed by herbs or killed by them. Either way, no one trusted the medics. The leather tents offered little mercy. In summer, they became ovens. In winter, ice formed on the inside walls. Rain turned the ground to mud that seeped through blankets, soaking men until they shivered in silence. Marcus learned to sleep in his armor, sword within reach, ready to wake and fight at a shout. Veterans could rise, dress, and arm themselves in darkness without a word. Marcus forced himself to copy them. At night, the camp came alive in its own way. Gambling, though forbidden, was everywhere. Dice rattling, coins changing hands, bets on who would survive punishment or who could wrestle the longest before collapse. Fights broke out, sometimes over money, sometimes over pride. The centurions looked the other way, so long as the men were strong enough to train the next morning. Merchants hovered at the edges of camp, selling food, mending gear, offering pleasures. Prostitutes slipped through shadows, their presence officially denied but practically tolerated. Men without coin made do with drink, or with each other, forming bonds that the officers pretended not to see. Marcus found his farm skills gave him an edge. He could barter preserved meat for better rations, tend to horses, patch leather gear. These trades earned him small favors, a little extra wine, sometimes protection. In a world where survival was bought daily, such skills mattered as much as a sword. But the worst part wasn't the food, the filth, or even the punishments. It was the sameness. Day after day, inspection, drills, meals, work, guard duty, kitchen duty, cleaning. The rhythm never ended. It ate at the mind, reducing men to shadows of who they had been. Marcus saw it in his tent mates, laughter fading, eyes hollow, voices dulled by exhaustion. Some broke. He heard of men who took their own lives, their bodies buried in shame without rights. Others drank themselves insensible, punished, until they staggered back into line. Yet even in this place of mud and misery, life found ways to continue. Marcus discovered that Titus could carve small figures from scraps of wood, horses mostly, and sometimes birds that looked ready to take flight. Quintus sang old farming songs under his breath while cleaning his gear, melodies that reminded them all of harvests and home. Gaius Antonius, for all his bitterness, knew stories that could make men laugh even when their feet were bleeding. These small graces didn't make the hardship bearable. Nothing could do that. But they made it human. They reminded the soldiers that beneath the leather and iron, something of who they had been still survived. Marcus learned to treasure these moments, the way lamplight softened hard faces, the sound of quiet laughter in the dark, the feeling of being surrounded by men who understood your burdens because they carried the same weight. And yet the camp had its facade. To visiting officers, it was order, discipline, Rome's might embodied in neat rows of tents and gleaming shields. But Marcus knew the truth. Beneath the surface was rot. The camp was efficient, yes, efficient at grinding men down, efficient at stripping them of self until only soldiers remained. Lying in the dark, shoulder pressed against Gaius's, listening to the snores and coughs and muttered dreams, Marcus realized something that chilled him more than disease or punishment. This wasn't a stage to pass through. It wasn't temporary hardship. This was life. Mud, sweat, rot, and bread crawling with mold. Not for days or months, but for decades. 25 years. The camp was not preparing him for war. It was the war. Endless, invisible, and relentless. And Marcus was already a prisoner within its walls. As Marcus settled into sleep each night, pressed close to men who had become closer than brothers, he understood that this too was part of a soldier's education, learning to find light in darkness, warmth in cold, companionship in suffering. The camp was harsh, yes, but it was also where he learned that survival was not a solitary act. In the whispered conversations after lights out, in the shared rations when someone fell sick, in the way they instinctively covered for each other's weaknesses, Marcus glimpsed something that no amount of hardship could quite destroy. They were being forged, all of them, in this crucible of mud and misery, but they were being forged together, and perhaps that would be enough to see them through whatever waited beyond the camp's walls. Time moved differently in the legions, not in days or weeks, but in marches and battles, in the slow accumulation of scars, both visible and hidden. They had promised him glory. They had promised honor. But when the forest exploded with war cries and the air filled with the stink of split bowels, Marcus understood the truth. War was butchery. He was both the butcher and the meat. The ambush struck without warning. One heartbeat, he was trudging along the muddy track, cursing his blisters and the weight of his pack. The next, the sky rained arrows. Men screamed, horses reared. The calm green of Germania turned into a nightmare of shadows and painted faces bursting from the trees. The world collapsed into noise, iron on iron, men shrieking, orders drowned in chaos. The forest floor quaked with the charge of bare-chested warriors, their bodies streaked with paint, their hair wild, their eyes mad with fury. Marcus barely had time to lock his shield in place before the soldier in front of him, Cassius, the steady veteran who had shown him how to oil armor against rust, staggered and fell. Time seemed to slow as Marcus watched Cassius fall. 3 arrows jutted from his back like broken branches. The veteran who had taught him to maintain his gear, who had shown him which prayers might keep a sword sharp and a shield strong, crumpled wordlessly into the mud. For a heartbeat, the forest was beautiful. Ancient trees catching shafts of golden sunlight, the kind of peace that made you forget the world held any violence at all. Birds called from hidden branches. Somewhere, water trickled over stones. It was hard to believe that in this quiet place, men were about to die. Marcus felt his breathing become shallow and rapid. Every shadow seemed to hide an enemy. Every sound might be a signal. He gripped his shield tighter, checked his sword for the 100th time, and tried to remember his training. Behind him, Gaius muttered a prayer to his family's gods. Ahead, veterans moved with the calm efficiency of men who had done this before. Marcus envied their certainty, not knowing that inside they felt the same cold fear that was eating at his stomach. The German war cries rose like thunder through the trees. Marcus took a deep breath of clean forest air and prepared to follow his brothers into whatever waited in the green shadows. 3 arrows jutted from his back like broken branches. He crumpled wordlessly, and the line surged forward over his body. The sight split Marcus open inside. He realized, with sudden clarity that stole his breath, I am going to die here. Not one day, not far in the future, but in minutes, in this mud, in this forest. There was no time for fear. A Germanic warrior was already upon him, eyes blazing, a long sword flashing down like lightning. Marcus raised his shield in a move drilled into him thousands of times. The impact rattled through his bones, forcing him to his knees. He thought the wood would splinter, but it held. And in the sliver of a heartbeat where the barbarian was exposed, Marcus struck. The gladius slid into flesh with a sound he would never forget. Wet, sucking, obscene. The man's eyes widened, his lips spattering blood as he looked down in disbelief at the blade buried in his chest. They locked eyes for a frozen instant. Marcus, trembling, barely more than a boy. The warrior, young too, his life breaking, like a clay pot. Then he toppled, dragging Marcus's sword free as he fell into the mud. Marcus stared. He had killed. The body at his feet wasn't a beast, wasn't a demon. It was just a man. A man who might have been a farmer, who might have carved wood with those rough hands, who would never rise again. But the tide of battle gave him no space for thought. Shouts pressed him forward. Another enemy came screaming. Arrows hissed past, So close he felt the air kiss his ear. His shoulders split with pain as a spear grazed him. His arms ached from lifting the shield, his grip numbed by shock. His second kill came almost by accident. A German boy, no older than his youngest brother back home, slipped on blood-slick ground and collapsed in front of him. The lad's face was pale with terror, blood streaming from a head wound. Marcus froze, seeing not an enemy, but a child. The boy's eyes begged, wide and wet with fear. For a heartbeat, Marcus couldn't move. Then instinct, drilled mercilessly into him, acted for him. He drove the gladius down. The boy convulsed once, then went still. His eyes, staring at nothing, would follow Marcus into every dream thereafter. The battle blurred. Marcus lost track of time, of place, of who he fought beside. Romans and Germans tangled in swarming knots, stabbing, clawing, choking each other in mud that ran red. There were no neat lines, no noble duels, only men killing however they could. He saw Gaius Valerius, the limping boy from his tent, lift his sword to shield a wounded comrade. An axe cleaved through his skull, spraying blood and bone. Titus, the blacksmith's son, roared like a bull until a spear tore through his throat. He staggered, still swinging as he drowned in his own blood. Marcus couldn't stop, couldn't mourn, couldn't cry. He stepped over their bodies, fighting on, because stopping meant joining them. At last, the enemy leader fell, a javelin in the chest. The Germans faltered, then broke, fading back into the trees. Silence fell, broken only by the groans of the dying. Marcus collapsed where he stood, shaking violently. His sword was slick, his arm trembling, his whole body soaked in sweat and gore. Around him lay the butchered remains of friend and foe alike, staring with blank eyes at the canopy above. Officers strode through, counting, recording, stripping the dead of weapons and armor. The machine of Rome turned even carnage into paperwork. Burial parties dug shallow graves for Romans. Germans were left for wolves and crows. Marcus helped lower Gaius into a pit, barely deep enough to cover him. No prayer, no rite, just a name scrawled on a wooden post before dirt was shoveled over the boy's broken face. By nightfall, the ground looked no different, as though he had never lived. That night, Marcus dreamt of the German boy's eyes, wide, wet, accusing. He woke gasping, fists clenched, convinced blood still dripped from his blade. Rome would call it a victory. Reports would speak of discipline, valor, the triumph of civilization. But Marcus knew. He had seen the truth. There was no glory, no honor, only blood, mud, and the slow grinding away of his soul. When the silence finally came, Marcus understood that something had died in that forest, beyond the German dead. Some part of himself that had believed in clean deaths and honorable combat lay buried beneath the blood-soaked leaves. But he was still breathing. His brothers beside him were still breathing. In the arithmetic of war, this counted as victory. He would learn to be grateful for such small mathematics, even when the cost seemed higher than any sane man would pay. The German boy's eyes would follow him, yes. But so would the memory of Cassius teaching him to oil his armor, of Gaius laughing at Titus's carved horses, of all the small human moments that made the brutality bearable. The forest would heal. Seasons would come and go. New growth would cover the scars, but Marcus would carry this place with him forever, not only as trauma, but as knowledge. The knowledge of what men could do when everything civilized fell away, and what they could still choose to preserve even then. It was a hard lesson, but it was his lesson now, written in blood and memory, and the faces of friends who would never see home again. The meat grinder had taken its first toll. It would never stop. And Marcus, still breathing, was already caught in its gears. They called them heroes when they conquered new lands. They called them veterans when they survived their years of service. But behind their eyes that had watched men torn apart, that had seen children burn with their villages, there lived a darkness no triumph could chase away. The changes came quietly, like shadows lengthening in the evening. Marcus would find himself listening to silence, waiting for sounds that weren't there. His hands would remember the weight of a sword when he was reaching for bread. Sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, he would be back in the forest again, not trapped there, but visiting, like checking on an old wound to see how it healed. He wasn't alone in this. He saw it in the way Lucius checked his gear obsessively, in how Quintus had grown so quiet, in the way they all startled at unexpected sounds. They carried the forest with them now, not as a burden exactly, but as a new kind of awareness, a soldier's knowledge of how quickly peace could shatter. He dropped the sword. His body jolted backward, colliding with the tent wall. Sweat soaked his tunic. His hands shook so hard he couldn't grip anything. For several minutes, he was certain the Germans were coming through the flap, certain the camp was about to be overrun. His tent mates froze. Some stared with concern. Others frowned, disturbed. A few whispered about curses. "First battle nerves," muttered Gaius Antonius, without looking up from his whetstone. "It'll pass." But it didn't. The ghosts returned in daylight. Bread turned to blood on his tongue. The clink of hobnailed sandals became the clash of steel. At night, he saw dead comrades standing by his bedroll, their faces pale and broken, asking him why they had died while he lived. Roman medicine had no word for this. The camp doctor looked at Marcus's trembling hands, listened to his stammered descriptions, and told him to bleed himself, as though ghosts could be drained like bad humors. Others said he was cursed, that Mars demanded further sacrifice. So Marcus hid it. He forced himself to march, to fight, to drill. He carried his ghosts in silence, because in the Legion, weakness was punished harder than wounds. He wasn't the only one. Lucius Maximus, the proud freedman's son, developed a twitch in his left eye that never stopped. Every night, he checked his sword 5, 6, 7 times before lying down, then checked it again in the dark, convinced unseen enemies were already inside the camp. Quintus Brutus, once cheerful as a farmhand, stopped speaking at all. He answered only when ordered, moving like an automaton, eyes glazed. Decimus Cassius began talking to shadows. Some nights, Marcus heard him chuckling at jokes no one else could hear. Other times, he argued with thin air, voice sharp with rage. Men started sleeping farther from him. But even Decimus, lost in conversations with ghosts, still remembered to share his rations when someone fell sick. Even Lucius, twitching and checking his sword obsessively, still carved small improvements into their shared equipment. The trauma changed them, but it didn't erase them. The camp doctors had no names for this, no treatments except time, and the brotherhood of men who understood without words what they had all seen and done. In quiet moments, they would sit together and remember who they had been before the forest, knowing they could never quite go back, but grateful they didn't have to go forward alone. None of them were cowards, none of them were cursed, but the Legion called it weakness, and weakness was punished. Soldiers who faltered were flogged. Those who drank too much to silence their nightmares were beaten bloody. The doctors prescribed prayers and more bloodletting. The worst came during the siege. A Germanic settlement had defied Rome. The Legion encircled it, starved it, then stormed the walls. Marcus went over the rampart with his cohort, gladius slick in his hand. What he found inside was not an army. It was a town. Old men with shaking hands held kitchen knives. Mothers clutched infants. Children screamed as the huts caught fire. Orders were clear, no survivors. Marcus's sword, drilled to strike without hesitation, obeyed when his mind screamed no. He cut down men too frail to stand, struck women who raised hands in desperation, stepped over burning cradles. The air stank of roasted flesh. His ears rang with screams that would never fade. That night, he vomited until bile scorched his throat. Yet the next morning, his officer praised the cohort for discipline, for efficiency, for serving civilization. Rome called it a victory. Marcus knew it was slaughter. The camp returned to routine. Inspections, drills, rations. But inside, Marcus unraveled further. He drank when he could, sour wine that dulled the ghosts for a few hours. When it wore off, they came back twice as strong. Lucius twitched. Quintus spoke less. Decimus raved at nothing. And Marcus lay awake in the dark, listening to silence that wasn't silent. Every creak was an axe. Every gust of wind was a scream. When he closed his eyes, the German boy he had killed in the forest appeared, staring, asking questions Marcus couldn't answer. Why me? Why my village? No ritual could silence him. No wine drowned him. He was there every night, in every dream. The Empire had won. Germania had burned. The Legion had triumphed. But Marcus had lost something he could never get back. His mind, his peace, himself. And the worst truth of all, Rome did not care. As winter gave way to spring, Marcus discovered that a soldier's education never truly ended. There were always new truths to learn, new illusions to shed. Marcus had been promised glory. That word had echoed in his ears since the first day he stood in the dusty square of his village, listening to the centurion's voice carry like a hymn. Glory. The man had painted pictures of laurel crowns, of songs sung in his honor, of eternal memory carved into the stones of Rome. And Marcus, barely more than a boy, had believed. Who wouldn't? His father's farm smelled of manure and sweat. His mother's hands were raw from grinding grain. The idea of becoming more, of becoming immortal through courage, had burned brighter than the fire in the hearth. But now, 3 years later, Marcus lay in a field of mud that would never be remembered, his hand pressed against a wound that would not stop bleeding. Around him, his brothers in arms gasped and coughed, dying in ways that poets never sang about. There were no trumpets here, no carved statues, no wreaths of honor, only the stench of spilled bowels, the buzzing of flies already gathering on fresh corpses, and the heavy silence that followed slaughter. This was Rome's truth, and it was nothing like the promises. He remembered the day of recruitment as if it were another life. The officer, Fabius, with his gleaming armor and perfectly rehearsed smile, had stood tall as he spoke of destiny. He promised honor for those who served, citizenship for those who fought bravely, pensions that would keep their families safe. He promised that to die in Rome's service was to achieve immortality. Marcus had looked at the veterans standing behind him, their bronze decorations catching the sun, and thought he saw his own future. He had been too young to notice the limp in their step, the haunted look in their eyes, the silence that followed when the officer boasted of glory. Reality, Marcus learned, was far crueler. The brotherhood was real, but it was a brotherhood born of pain, not triumph. Men clung to one another because only they could understand the nightmares that stalked them at night. And honor? Honor was reserved for men who never raised a blade, for generals who sent thousands to their deaths from the safety of tents. The truth revealed itself in the villages they burned. The campaign that had once been described as a noble defense of Roman borders was, in truth, the destruction of a people who had committed no crime but standing in Rome's path. Marcus remembered one such village clearly, a small cluster of homes on the edge of a river. Children had been playing when his unit stormed the gates at dawn. Old men had tried to resist with farming tools. Women had screamed as the cavalry encircled the fleeing crowd. The official report would later describe this as a decisive victory against barbarian raiders. But Marcus knew what it had been: the slaughter of farmers, the murder of families, the burning of a community that had threatened no one. That night, as they sat around the campfires, the centurion spoke of the day's glory, of Rome's greatness, of the spoils they had secured for the empire. But Marcus could still smell the smoke of charred houses, still hear the keening wails of mothers over their dead. Glory. He spat in the dirt. It was a lie, a beautiful lie told to men like him so they would keep killing. And yet, in the morning, when Titus shared his last piece of bread with a wounded comrade, Marcus glimpsed something that felt like honor. When Quintus helped an older soldier whose legs had given out during the march, he saw something worth preserving. The glory the recruiters had promised was false, but the bonds forged in shared suffering were real. Perhaps that was the only truth that mattered. Not the stories others told about them, but the choices they made when no one was watching, when there was no reward except the knowledge that they had remained human despite everything designed to strip their humanity away. The poets in Rome sang of valor. The statues in the Forum carved soldiers into eternal heroes. Victory parades marched plunder through the streets, showing citizens the wealth their sons had bought with blood. But none of them saw the trenches Marcus dug for corpses that would never have names. None of them walked through the mud where flies swarmed over the faces of boys who had once laughed and dreamed of home. The lie stretched further. The promise of citizenship, held out like a jewel before the eyes of foreign recruits, was another cruel bait. Yes, it could be earned, but only after 25 years of service. 25 years of surviving mud, plague, frost, ambushes, and wounds that rarely healed clean. Few ever lived to see that day. And those who did? They discovered that Roman citizenship without wealth or land was a hollow prize. Marcus had seen men discharged with their papers, limping home only to beg for work like common beggars. Some never made it home at all. And the pension? Another lie dressed as generosity. Land grants were given in barren territories, impossible to farm without slaves that a poor veteran could never afford. Coins promised as payment were delayed, reduced, or stolen by corrupt officials. Marcus remembered an older soldier, Decimus, who had survived 15 brutal campaigns. When his time came, the reward Rome handed him was a patch of swamp in a hostile frontier. Within months, the man was dead, his family destitute, his decades of service dissolved like mist in morning sun. The myth of glorious death was the worst deception of all. Rome promised immortality in memory, songs that would carry a soldier's name forever. But Marcus had dug too many shallow graves, marked by nothing more than a pile of stones to believe it. The names of his friends would not live on, not in marble, not in poetry, not in the songs of bards. They were gone, erased as if they had never existed. Their glory was recorded only in numbers, tallies of casualties on reports written by men who had never bled in the mud. And still, the machine ground on. Recruiters returned to villages, telling the same stories Marcus had once believed. Wide-eyed boys would step forward, dreaming of honor, blind to the truth waiting in the shadows. Rome needed soldiers, and so the lie endured, more powerful than truth, more seductive than memory. Marcus knew now that he was part of a cycle, one that would not break in his lifetime. Marcus felt no anger at the recruiters now, only a weary understanding. They had told him what he needed to hear to take the first step. The rest, the real education, could only come through living it. Perhaps that was the only way it could be. Perhaps boys became men not through the stories they were told, but through learning to see past those stories to something truer underneath. The brotherhood was real. even if the glory was not. The strength he had found in himself was real. The roads they built would last for centuries. These things had value, even if it wasn't the value he had expected. He had been changed by Rome, broken and rebuilt according to its needs. But in that breaking and rebuilding, he had discovered parts of himself he never would have known existed. It was a hard gift, but it was his. His youth, his innocence, his humanity had all been consumed by an empire that saw him not as a man, but as grain to be ground into flour, baked into bread, and consumed without thought. He would die, perhaps in another nameless forest, his bones left to rot beneath trees that cared nothing for Rome. And yet, the myth of glory would outlive him, feeding on the lives of others. That was Rome's true genius. Not its legions, not its weapons, not its walls, but its ability to turn lies into faith, to make men believe that suffering was noble, that death was beautiful, that silence was honor. Marcus closed his eyes. The sounds of camp muffled around him and felt the weight of the truth pressed down heavier than his armor. Glory was never theirs. It belonged to others, to generals, to senators, to emperors whose names would be remembered while his was forgotten. And as he drifted into uneasy sleep, Marcus prayed that some future soul would see through the lie, would speak the truth aloud. But deep down, he feared the truth would always remain buried, along with the bodies of the men who had lived, fought, and died for nothing more than a story Rome had told them. The years passed like distant thunder, each campaign a season in the long harvest of empire. Until one day, the harvest was complete, and Marcus faced the question all soldiers must answer. Who are you when the war is over? After 25 years of marching across half the known world, bleeding for an empire that devoured men like fire devours dry wood, Marcus Aurelius Brutus finally received his reward. A plot of rocky land in the God-forsaken mountains of eastern Pannonia. 20 acres of dirt so thin it could barely feed goats. A spring that dried by midsummer. A week's walk from the nearest Roman town, through bandit-haunted forests. This wasn't a reward. It was exile, disguised as generosity. The ceremony had been grand enough, banners waving, trumpets blaring, officers giving speeches about honor, loyalty, and eternal glory. Veterans were handed documents, citizenship papers, and 3,000 denarii each. But behind the polished words and ceremonial pomp, the men knew the truth. Rome wasn't honoring them. Rome was discarding them. Marcus was 44, though his body carried twice those years. His shoulders ached from old spear wounds, his knee shattered by a barbarian's club, his hands trembling from decades of cold marches and endless combat. The eager farm boy, who had once dreamed of glory, was long gone. What stood at the frontier's edge was a scarred, broken man, a tool Rome had used until it snapped. He had fought in 17 campaigns. Across Gaul, Germania, Britannia, and Pannonia, he had bled, killed, and survived. He had been decorated 3 times, promoted to optio, never once accused of cowardice, never once failed an order. And yet, when the time came, he was processed like cattle. Those with wealth or connections were sent to fertile lands near bustling cities. Men like Marcus, poor, unknown, used up, were sent to the edge of nowhere. The veteran colony he was dumped into wasn't even dignified with a name. Imperial records listed it as Veteran Colony Number 47, 50 scattered huts on barren ground, half-broken soldiers and their starving families trying to coax life out of worthless soil. Neighbors were either equally desperate veterans or tribal people who despised Rome, and despised the settlers even more. The money Rome gave him was little more than a cruel joke, enough to Buy basic tools and a mule, gone within 2 years if stretched. Yet some evenings, when the wind was still and the stars particularly bright, Marcus could almost convince himself this was peace. No trumpets to wake him before dawn, no centurions to please, no comrades to bury, just the slow rhythm of seasons, the honest work of coaxing life from stubborn soil, the satisfaction of building something that might outlast him. It wasn't the peace he had imagined during those long marches through Germania, but it was his, hard-won and honestly earned, even if Rome had tried to give him as little as possible. The promise of citizenship, meaningless in these wastelands. Paper rights did nothing when bandits came in the night, or when tribal raiders set fire to your home. What stung Marcus most was the memory of his family farm. He had once dreamed of returning after service, taking back the soil he'd tilled as a boy. But his father died, his mother soon after, and his younger brother had sold the farm to survive. Now senators owned the land, and slaves worked the fields where Marcus had once run as a child. His homecoming had been stolen before he even returned. Life in the settlement was cruel. Scarred comrades turned into beggars, tavern keepers selling watered wine for coin veterans didn't have, men who had once commanded legions reduced to scavengers. Some turned to crime, smuggling, or mercenary raids, becoming the very bandits Rome had sent them to defend against. Others drank themselves into the grave, unable to silence the nightmares. Many simply walked away, abandoning their worthless farms and fading into the cities as forgotten beggars. Marcus tried to farm. He tried to remember how his father had plowed, how his mother had planted, but his ruined body betrayed him. His crops withered, his tools broke, and winter came crueler each year. But his hands remembered more than soldiering. Slowly, patiently, he learned to read this harsh land the way he had once learned to read enemy movements, where water might gather, which slopes would hold against wind, how to build walls that would stand when the storms came. The farm was poor, but it was his. The land was hard, but he had been made harder. And sometimes, in the evening light, he could see his mother's hands in his own as he worked the earth, could hear his father's voice in the way he planned each season's planting. He turned to hunting and trapping, relying once again on the skills of a soldier, not a farmer. But even the forests hated him. Pannonian tribes remembered too well the legions that had slaughtered their fathers. To them, Marcus wasn't a farmer. He was an invader. He had traded the battlefield for loneliness, days without human voices, nights with only ghosts for company. His comrades visited him in dreams, men he had buried in shallow graves, men whose faces he could never forget. Rome had abandoned them too. The cruelest irony was clear. Rome had promised peace after service, but peace never came. The veterans were simply Rome's frontier guards, unpaid, broken shields left to rot on the edge of empire. Their suffering saved the treasury money. Their deaths made room for new recruits. Marcus knew it now. The glory, the honor, the promises, all lies. The empire had stolen his youth, broken his body, hollowed out his soul, and handed him a worthless farm where he would slowly wither. His service hadn't been rewarded. It had been erased. And so, as winter's chill crept into his bones, Marcus understood that this was his final campaign. Not against Gauls or Germans, but against hunger, cold, and despair. A war he was destined to lose. Rome had already forgotten him. Soon, the world would too. In the end, all roads lead somewhere. Even the hardest journeys, the longest marches, eventually find their destination. For Marcus, that destination was not what he had expected, but it was his own. Look around. Every triumph of Rome, every marvel of stone and water, every road that stretches to the horizon, all of it rests on bones. The Appian Way, straight as an arrow through hills and valleys, was not just a road, it was a graveyard paved with the sweat and blood of soldiers. Each milestone was more than distance. It was a marker of pain, of men bent and broken beneath the weight of empire. When Marcus walked that road on rare leave, he no longer saw engineering genius. He saw ghosts. He heard hammers striking rock, men cursing in exhaustion, whips cracking when strength gave out. Rome celebrated the smooth stone beneath his feet. Marcus remembered the men who died laying it. The irony was cruel beyond words. For 25 years, Marcus had fought and bled on the very roads he and his comrades had built. Soldiers weren't just Rome's shield. They were its slaves of stone, forced to build the arteries of an empire that discarded them when they broke. Roads, aqueducts, walls, ports, all the glory of Roman civilization carried on the backs of men who were promised honor but delivered misery. Marcus remembered a stretch of road through German marshlands, soldiers standing waist-deep in icy water, pounding stakes into mud, frost biting their skin raw. Some drowned when foundations collapsed. Others died coughing blood from sickness that spread in the damp. 10 miles of road, dozens of lives, and Rome recorded it as an engineering achievement. Every monument of Rome was built the same way. Hadrian's Wall, hailed as a wonder of defense, was a decade-long death sentence for 3 entire legions. The aqueducts that brought cool, clean water to marble villas were built by men who often died of thirst while cutting channels through mountains. The Colosseum, where crowds roared for blood, was raised by hands that never received a single cheer. Marcus had been part of it all. He quarried stone under the sun of Spain, carved canals through deserts, raised walls in the frozen north, and built amphitheaters where he would never sit as a spectator. His hands carried Rome's greatness, yet his name, like every other soldier's, was erased from the story. Credit went to emperors, architects, and engineers. The workers were forgotten. The brutality of it never left him. He had watched men beaten senseless for laying stones unevenly, starved for failing to meet impossible quotas, flogged for resting too long in the heat. Rome's legendary durability wasn't just skill, it was fear. Perfection was beaten into existence. And what was their reward? Not even remembrance. The aqueducts flowed for centuries. The roads carried armies long after Marcus was dust. The walls stood against enemies yet unborn. But the men who built them, their suffering, their deaths, their very existence, vanished into silence. That was Rome's true genius, not just in architecture, but in erasing the human cost. The empire wrote stories of glory while burying the misery beneath the stones. The people walked smooth roads without knowing the corpses that paved them. They drank clear water without tasting the sweat of the men who dug the channels. They lived behind walls without hearing the screams of those who had raised them. Marcus understood it now, at the end. His life had been consumed in building a machine greater than any one man, yet utterly indifferent to the men who powered it. Rome's legacy would last for millennia. His own would end in obscurity, on a worthless frontier farm where no monument bore his name. The empire's greatness would be admired forever. But it was built on broken backs, millions of them, forgotten men who carried stones, swung hammers, and bled into the earth. Their pain was the foundation. Their silence was the cement. Their bodies were the scaffolding. Rome's monuments would endure. The men who built them would not. In the end, Marcus died as quietly as he had lived since leaving the legions, alone, forgotten, and carrying secrets too heavy for any one man to bear. If a grave marker existed at all, it would have listed only his name and years of service. The true cost of Rome, the lives it drained and discarded, would be buried with him, swallowed by the silence the empire demanded from all who bore its burdens. The winter of Marcus's 50th year was the harshest he had ever endured. Snow fell without pause, smothering his small farm until drifts reached the roof of his hut. The spring that once gave him water froze solid for the first time since he had settled on that land. His food stores, meager to begin with, dwindled into nothing before the first thaw. One morning in early spring, Marcus slipped quietly from life. Marcus died as he had learned to live in those final years, quietly, without complaint, watching the seasons turn from his chair by the window. The neighbor who found him saw not a broken old soldier, but a man who had faced whatever came with steady courage. There was peace in his expression, the peace of someone who had finally laid down a load too heavy for any one person to carry. He had lived to see his small farm bloom. Nothing grand, a few fruit trees, a garden that fed him through the winters, stone walls that would stand long after he was gone. It wasn't much by Roman standards, but it was enough. It was his. The wooden marker would weather and fade, as all things do. But the roads he had built still stretched across the countryside, carrying travelers toward destinations he would never see. The stones he had laid still stood firm against wind and weather. In ways that Rome had never intended to honor, his work endured. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps in the end, it had always been enough. A neighbor who came days later to barter grain found him sitting in his chair by a dead hearth, wrapped in the worn military cloak that had been his companion for 3 decades. His body bore the long tally of Rome's demands, scarred, broken, consumed by a lifetime of service that had given everything and returned almost nothing. There was no funeral, no ceremony, no gathering of mourners. He was buried in a shallow grave behind his hut, beneath a wooden post inscribed with the bare words, Veteranus, 25 years service. Within a decade, mountain wind and weather would erase even that fragile memorial. Rome recorded his death as little more than an entry in a ledger, another pension obligation resolved by natural causes. The clerks who wrote his name had never heard it before and would never think of it again. Marcus was not a man in their eyes, only an expense finally removed from the empire's accounts. But the silence that smothered his death was no accident of bureaucracy. It was deliberate, a silence woven into the very machinery of empire. Marcus had lived through the reality behind Rome's mythology, the brutality hidden beneath propaganda, the exploitation concealed behind marble facades, the transformation of flesh and blood men into disposable cogs of conquest. His end was not unique. Across the provinces, countless veterans died in the same obscurity, alone, impoverished, abandoned by the civilization they had raised with their own labor. Each shallow grave held not just a body, but a truth too dangerous for Rome to acknowledge. Each erased name was another stone laid in the empire's wall of silence. The stars that had watched over his last night were the same stars that had shone on his first march, his first battle, his first glimpse of home. Under that eternal sky, the boy and the soldier and the farmer were all the same person. Someone who had done what was asked of him, who had carried what was given him to carry, who had found meaning not in the promises others made, but in the choices he made himself. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of all the words that didn't need to be spoken, all the stories that lived on in the stones themselves. Marcus had become part of something larger than himself, not through glory, but through simple persistence, not through conquest, but through endurance. The mountain wind that eventually weathered away his marker also carried seeds from his fruit trees to distant slopes. The walls he built became foundations for other builders. The roads he helped carve carried not just legions, but merchants, pilgrims, families seeking new homes. Rome recorded his death as a pension obligation resolved. But the land was remembered differently. In the patient way that Earth keeps its accounts, Marcus had left more than he had taken. He had planted more than he had harvested. He had built more than he had destroyed. And in that quiet arithmetic of seasons and stone, of seeds planted and walls raised, there was a kind of victory after all. Not the victory of trumpets and triumphs, but the victory of things that last. The empire that had consumed his youth was already beginning its long decline. But the roads would endure, the walls would stand, and somewhere, in gardens he would never see, his trees would bloom each spring, carrying forward a legacy written not in marble, but in the patient language of growth and renewal. Marcus had found his peace, not in the promises of recruiters or the speeches of generals, but in the simple truth that a man could choose what to build, even from the ruins of what had been taken from him.